views expressed on this program are those of the hosts, guests, and callers, and are not necessarily those of this station, its management, or other advertisers. You're listening to Transformation Talk Radio.
Welcome to the hit show Love Living Radio. Ignite your whole being with Emily Perkins on transformationtalkradio.com. Do you love your life? Are you truly free in being your authentic self? In a stress-filled world full of distractions, Love Living Radio is a space to explore how mindful presence can steer you toward an ignited life. What does a life you really love look like? Emily shares her innermost vulnerabilities and breaks down barriers through conversations about sex and relationships, the magic of plant medicine, and so much more in order to share the power of living your life with love and loving the life you live. Now, here's your host.
Hey, everybody. Welcome. I am Emily Perkins, and you are listening to Love Living Radio. And you're also joined by Mulligan, as usual, always wanting to be part of the show. And today I have the very distinct honor of being joined by someone I've known for quite a long time and who has been a huge supporter of Love Living Radio from the very beginning. I've gotten just such wonderful feedback and support throughout pretty much the entire process of this radio show, which has been a pretty vulnerable and exciting venture for me. So I'm really honored to introduce you all to Al Basil. He is a poet, singer, songwriter, and a pretty incredible cornetist. He has put out 15 CDs, which to me are 15 albums, which is kind of remarkable, and has written two books of poetry, which are just pretty amazing. He sent me some of his stuff, and I've been very fortunate to be able to receive a lot of his incredible genius, starting from when I was in high school, which is actually the reason that Al and I know each other. He was my English teacher in high school. So, in all honesty, I think Al has been supporting me since I was, 15 to 18?
Mm-hmm.
So, Al, do you want to say a little hello to everybody?
Sure. I really never thought I'd be on this show, although I have dutifully watched and listened to everyone that I could. And it's very easy to support Emily and what she's doing because she's doing a great thing and she's doing a great job. So I'm, as a critic, I'm only as good as my subject. She's a great subject.
Thank you. Yeah, I know. I was so excited. One, because you've been probably my biggest supporter throughout this whole radio show adventure that I've been on. And talking to you about I think in one of your emails like a month ago, you were like, hey, would you ever think about doing an episode on forgiveness? And it's been like that so much of the time with this radio show that the topics just kind of come up like that so beautifully. And it's almost like you, my guides, the universe just kind of like hands over the next topic. And I was like, ooh, that'd be great. Do you want to come on and talk about it with me? And that's kind of why we're here and how we got here today. And when I asked you about coming on the show, you were like, oh my gosh, I have this great poem that I'd love to share, to kind of talk about what forgiveness is for you and how you relate to it. So, it's also feels kind of perfect for who you are to be able to share this gift that you have with people. And personally, for me, reading your poetry, it's like, I think it's your version of how I communicate in these radio shows. It's like this beautiful insight into who you are, into the heart of who you are.
Yeah. You figured it out. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, it's cool because we have these really different but also similar ways of communicating. And
I have you had the training that gives you a whole set of words that mean very specific things. And I figured out what I know about these topics on my own. And so we may not use exactly the same language, but we're talking about the same things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. The essence of it is the same. Yeah. Yeah. So would you do us the great honor of sharing the poem?
Sure. This is a poem. It's maybe my first introduction to what can happen when you can't forgive someone. Because I was a child and I really didn't encounter that in my own family because we didn't hold grudges. And it just was a new thing to me. But my mother had a cousin, and this is her story. It's called The Unforgivable. Something happened on her honeymoon, the unforgivable. A day or two, a week at most, she showed up back at home, never to speak of what she'd been put through. Living again with parents and her sister with no thought of annulment or divorce, she kept her husband's name until she died, and bitterness and shame had run their course, but not one day before. The way she spoke his name in conversation gave a chill, laced with contempt, familiarity, and helpless hanging on the words that kill. I was her cousin's son, born in what would have been the time of her own children's birth, and I was prized each Sunday after Mass out of all proportion to my worth. Fed the precious saved-up delicacies, torrone, nut, and nougat, hard to chew but not to be declined, and sugar-iced egg cookies, chocolate mint pan candy too, all too sweet by half. When I was older, it was anisette and fresh pizzelles, still soft and bendable, warm from the iron. Gifts lavished on me so as to compel my sitting still for those two single sisters. One knotted up by marriage, all too brief. The other 4'6" and hunchbacked, thought fit only for the convent. What relief their substitute affections could provide them, I never knew, but they were always kind, despite all the demands of their devotion. I kept the unforgivable in mind. What could have soured the new bride on her man so thoroughly she never could let go, yet never could accept? The mystery was deep. Even my mother didn't know. When I was old enough, my father took me to the barber shop. Amid the smell of tonic and Vitalis, clipping hair, men's talk, and quiet with his clientele stood the man in question, plain and trim, with black-rimmed glasses and a patient air, adjusting the position of a head, applying gentle pressure here and there. In short, he didn't fit the storyline. Unlikeliest of monsters, he was tame, which only brought me back to the dilemma of what he'd done, for what he was to blame. So here's the rub. Was he a specimen of vileness out of mind, so well concealed he bore no single trace of evil nature until in secret it could be revealed behind the closed door of the bridal chamber? Or was his sin common in man and wife, grown monstrous in the eyes of one who'd led, much to her grief, a far too sheltered life? Might we judge she was too sensitive, her hopes disgorged, too quick to run away and settle for a life in opposition to the absent one who'd come to stay? We will never know the truth of this. All principles are dead, all secrets kept. What is the unforgivable to you? What in and of itself must we accept? And that's accept, not accept, the last word.
Mm.
So what is unforgivable?
Yeah. So what was it that drew you to share that today in talking about forgiveness? And honestly, though, I was thinking about this today, like, what was it that had you reach out and actually want me to do a show on forgiveness?
I've thought about that because in the time since you said, yeah, let's do this, I've been giving it, I thought about it as a topic, and then I tried to personalize it as much as I could. And so right away I thought of this poem because this is something that happened when I was just a small boy. But then I thought about recent developments in my life, and I think it must have something to do with this. That a woman with whom I was in love for a number of years, for 5 years, when we were very young, and with whom or from whom I parted in circumstances such that I felt like I'd let her down. And I just read that she died in the spring. And so I've been thinking about her a lot. I've written about her. And now as I look at it, it seems to me that maybe forgiveness was in my mind because I understand that if there was anything left that she could forgive me for, that I could know, I wouldn't be able to know going forward. So maybe that's where it came from. I can't be sure.
So I guess what I hear in that is like, are you left feeling like there's a longing for forgiveness?
I have to say that aside from the perception that you've hurt somebody, which is a strong enough feeling, she never gave me the feeling that she didn't forgive me, because I think it wasn't in her nature to carry the kind of weight on her own shoulders that my aunt's cousin did all her life. I've been very lucky that way. So that the people who've hurt me, I think understand that I've forgiven them and I carry nothing of that, certainly not within me. And likewise, the people from whom I've needed forgiveness, I've always felt have given it to me. But I think when you come to the end of somebody's life and realize that you can't ask them anymore if there was any part of it left unsaid, it's natural for that back into your, back into your mind.
Yeah. And I guess at that point you're left, I feel like at that point you're left with only one option, which is to forgive yourself.
Yeah. Well, of course, I've dealt with that long since, because we're talking about things that happened 50 years ago. So, the definition of forgiveness, that it's a letting go of what you're carrying about the hurt that someone has done to you, without regard to whether or not they deserve it, because it's really an action of self-healing on your part. You're doing it for yourself, not specifically for them. So it isn't so much whether they deserve it or if they ask for it. It's something that you need to do within yourself so that you're not carrying that weight forward any longer. Whether the people are in your life or out of your life is a whole other issue.
Yeah, I 100% agree. How I've always, or not always, but I guess in the past 3 years, how I've related to forgiveness is that it's, like you said, an act of self-healing, an act of self-love, to release that burdensome energy that really, truly weighs on you and affects you and hinders you more than it does anybody else.
Yeah. One of the great quotes about forgiveness is, there's no love without forgiveness. There's no forgiveness without love. And that's also true of the forgiveness that's involved with forgiving yourself. And I think people that have trouble forgiving themselves begin with the trouble they have loving themselves.
That the people that have trouble.
It's interesting. If the definition is you forgive without regard for desert, for whether it's deserved, then wouldn't you forgive yourself without worrying about your own self-worth?
Yeah.
Now, there's another part of that, though, which is it's fine to forgive yourself, but if it has to do with some kind of behavior that can recur, you got to get beyond just forgiving yourself. Otherwise, you got to get out of jail free card to just do what you want. So that's another side of it, is how you, which things you need to change within yourself going forward. With or without the people that you originally hurt or were hurt by. Because sometimes people come in and go out of our lives, but if we haven't settled the question within ourselves, we're not ready for the next person either. I don't know if that makes sense to you. I meant to ask you this is because truly I feel like I've had it pretty easy. I think that you had harder things to deal with, and I would guess a harder road toward forgiveness for some things that have happened to you. Is that fair to say?
Yeah. No, there have been definitely some moments in my life where forgiveness has been a challenge, I think. And I think the thing that kind of brings me back to it, and, so I guess one of the biggest places in my life where I would have to say forgiveness was something that I had to actively choose. I really had to choose. And I think ultimately forgiveness is always a choice.
Yeah.
It's always a choice at the very most for yourself.
If it's a choice, if you can make it, and sometimes it's a choice that people can't make. And that sends me back to my mother's cousin. For some reason, she couldn't make that choice. But I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, that's perfect, because that was actually a little piece that we had left unsaid. So I'm glad that you put that in, that the poem was about her inability to forgive and how that then kind of reflected on her life. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And, I was just a child. I saw a woman who very clearly was a very loving person, but she had very few outlets for giving love. And that she had doors that were closed and boarded up related to giving love. So it's very interesting. Like I say in the poem, if she had had children with her husband, they would have been my age. So my whole childhood, that had to be what I represented to her. With what didn't happen for her.
Yeah, I also hear in that like by her choosing not to forgive, that it held back the amount of love that she could get and give.
Yes. Yeah. And it was something you could feel. We talk a lot about coming to terms with oneself and, do you love yourself and can you forgive yourself and all of that. But if you're of a passionate nature and you have very strong blocks, I think you radiate that. I think people around you can feel it.
Can feel the blocks?
Yeah. Can feel that there's a conflict between a person with a loving nature, but who can't stop condemning somebody for something he did in 1 week years before.
Yeah, and I think that sometimes forgiveness, like, even if we think it's about someone else, I think ultimately it comes down to whether or not we can forgive ourselves. You know, I really do think that if we look at it from a place of ownership, that it's ultimately whether or not we can forgive ourselves.
You know, if it's a relationship kind of thing, I think you're exactly right. That I think we always ought to have an instinct that nothing happens in the relationship that's unilaterally created. That somehow in a partnership, there's a reflection on both of you for what happens. Whether it looks like one person is doing all the initiating or not. Because together you create the world in which that pain lives. You know? So I think you're right. I think there's always, it's always good to search your own heart and say, is there some way in which I was complicit or, you know, brought this out, or am I completely... I'll tell you a story if you don't mind, a quick story.
Yeah. And then I'm going to spin off of that because that actually perfectly leads me into actually answering your question from before.
Well, so I don't know how close we're getting to your halftime break either.
We have about 7 minutes.
All right, I've got plenty of time. Well, when I was in boarding school, it was an all-boys boarding school, and we were pretty hard on each other. So there was no social life at this boarding school, but they would send us in buses to girls' schools around New England for these dances, these tea dances, they called them. And I went to one it might have been a Walnut Hill. And what they used to do was to pair you up with a girl from the school, and then you would go into this dance, and the girls were required to stay with you for 2 dances. And then they could do what they wanted. So you'd go to these dances, and 15 minutes into the dance, there'd be about 20 of us guys standing around going, what happened? Because the girls had retreated to their dorms and were never to be seen again. So this happened to me, one of these dances. And so I was by myself and I was looking around, and I saw this really nice looking girl sitting in an easy chair on the other side of the room. And I watched her for a while, and nobody talked to her. She didn't get up to dance. You know, she was just there. So I went over to her and I started talking to her. And she was very engaging. She was very nice. The reason she was sitting in the easy chair was that she explained that she had a medical condition. One of her legs was shorter than the other. And so she, you know, felt that she was grounded. And so she was just sitting watching. They made her go to this dance, the school. So we talked for a little bit longer. And finally I said to her, you know, it is a dance, and we don't have to be good at it to participate. So what do you think? You want to give it a try? And so she said, okay. And so we danced. And so this was what it was. And then the night ended, and she went back to her dorm, and I got on the bus and went back to school. For the next 6 months, guys I didn't even know would walk by me and say, I understand you like cripples. I want to introduce you to somebody I know in a wheelchair. And this was like a very mean-spirited thing to do. But to speak to your point, I had been at that dance. I knew what I did was a good thing. So when those guys were saying that stuff to me, I knew instinctively that I didn't carry any blame for that. I knew it was their problem, and they were the one with the problem. And so that brings me to the point I want to make is there's some kinds of hurt that require your permission. And this was an example where somebody tried to hurt me, but I didn't give them permission because I knew I hadn't done anything wrong. In fact, I knew I'd done something good. So
Yeah.
That's worth thinking about, is when people hurt you, it isn't so much that you've been complicit somehow, but somehow you let if there's something they're saying, you let it get to you. Now, not all situations are like that, because obviously sometimes people force themselves on you, and that's something else.
Mm-hmm.
But some pain you really don't have to give permission to.
Yeah. I think even the hardest challenges, even the biggest traumas, even the deepest hurts, I think that actually does totally resonate. At least it does for me, that we get to choose how deep it goes. We get to choose to a certain degree. Some of it is like physical trauma gets woven into our tissue, but even in that, we get to choose how we want to heal it. We get to choose whether or not we get to be with it. We get to choose all of it. I hear such beautiful ownership in how we choose to be with something in that, whether you take on that feeling of blame or guilt or whatever from those boys, or acknowledge that that's not yours to take.
Right. I mean, I knew they had a problem, but I knew it wasn't my problem.
Yeah.
I mean, I had other problems, but that wasn't it. So that's, so I wanted to tell that story just because that was a way of life in boarding school for me, was that people tried to hurt each other verbally.
Mm-hmm.
And so you really had to come to grips with that fact and decide how you were going to deal with it. And it's easy to say, don't let yourself be a victim.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not a switch that you can flip on or flip off.
No.
And I remember I just want to go a little bit further with this, but I interrupted you a while back, and you were going to say something. So remind yourself what it was.
I do. I totally remember.
Well,
and that's perfect timing, because we're actually going to take a break. And then we'll come back and we'll dive into that thing.
The Knowledge Book, currently studied in 39 countries and 15 languages around the world, accelerates our evolution, takes us out of depression, offers universal truth, protects us, and makes us stronger, both spiritually and physically. So if you are interested in the Knowledge Book, visit usa.theknowledgebook.net and tune in to the Knowledge Book Radio with Marge Potasic on TransformationTalkRadio.com.
Tune in to The Truth is Funny with Colette Steffen each Wednesday at 8 a.m. Pacific, 11 a.m. Eastern on TransformationTalkRadio.com. This hit show will have you thinking outside the box and riding the wave of infinite potential. Join Colette on the Higher Self Network, inspiring listeners to shine their brilliance and ensure success while roaring with laughter as they recognize the humor of the giant cosmic joke. Visit thetruthисfunny.com.
Demystifying the Journey on From Here to There Radio with your host, Diane Garris. Tune in every third Wednesday, 4 p.m. Pacific Time on TransformationTalkRadio.com as Diane helps you get from where you are now to the life you envision. Get ready to get unstuck and move forward. Every show features a new special segment, New Age Notes, demystifying hot metaphysical topics of the day. For more information or to work with Diane, visit DianeGarris.com.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back. You are listening and watching Love Living Radio, and I am your host, Emily Perkins. And today we are joined by a dear friend, Basil, and we are talking about forgiveness. And before the break, we were talking a little bit about how forgiveness is an act of self-love and it's an act of self-healing, and how it is ultimately a choice which you give yourself, really, as a way of releasing burdensome energy. And also, one of the points that Al kind of made that I loved so much is that one of the consequences of not choosing forgiveness is less love, less love that you are able to feel, less love that you are able to receive. And it's true, because not forgiving is like holding on to this energy inside of you that just kind of stops. It's like a wall. And I think, Al, actually, you use that word, that it's like a wall. And we also talked a little bit about like, how do you forgive in moments and around things that are deeply wounding. Al asked me a question about, which I promised we would talk about after the break, about how, basically, I guess, kind of how I've chosen forgiveness despite some of the deeper traumas in my life, such as rape. Because I think for a lot of people, it would be kind of hard to imagine forgiveness in that kind of situation. And when we were talking about this episode and what we would want to touch on, Al brought this up, and he said, I'm just curious about how did you forgive the man who raped you, and how? And I thought about it a lot this week, and there's a couple of different points. One, actually a bunch of them we've talked about. I knew that ultimately it was going to be a choice for me. It was an act of self-love for me to choose forgiveness, because holding on to it was like this. It was like a cloud. It held me. It defined me, or I allowed it to define me in so many ways. And I got to the point where I just, a huge part of it, I think, was in my spiritual journey, wanting to heal and move past. And another part of it was choice. Like, I had to actively choose that was what was right for me. And then I think another piece of it was the thing that we talked about just before the break, was ownership. And ownership is not actually blame. Ownership isn't me saying it's my fault. Ownership is actually empowering. It's me being like, okay, this is my life. I'm choosing right now not to be a victim. And in not choosing to be a victim, I'm going to own this is my experience. This happened to me, and I get to choose to release it. I get to choose to let it go and not define me as a person. And I guess, does that kind of answer your question, Al?
Well, yes. I've got a follow-up question. But first of all, I'm really grateful that you have this ability to speak with such candor and sincerity about stuff that really would sink most people. But that leads me to my follow-up question, which is, when you're dealing with something that's that deep-seated, even though you make a choice, I would guess you don't just make that choice one day and that's the end of it. It's got to be a process. And what was that like for you? Because you have to continue to confirm what you're calling your ownership, and you have to continue to choose to allow yourself to be healed day after day after day. Mm-hmm. So what was that? How much of a part of your life was that process?
10 years. No, I mean, it was 10 years of processing the trauma before I really felt like I released it. But I think that the thing that kept me coming back to the choice of forgiveness was the relief in it. In choosing forgiveness, I wasn't making it okay. That's a huge point.
Right.
Forgiveness is not saying, okay, I'm okay with the fact that this happened to me, whether it's heartbreak, whether it's divorce, whether it's rape, whether it's physical trauma or it's deep emotional trauma. Forgiveness is not saying it's okay. It's actually just saying, I release this in service of me.
Yeah.
And that's what had me choose it over and over and over again, because it was for me. It wasn't for him. It wasn't really for anybody else in my life. It was a freedom.
You began feeling that at the moment that you made the choice, and then you continued to feel it for a long period of time.
Yeah. Well, and this is, I think, part of a little bit about what you were talking about in the beginning, I think, or before the break, that like the awareness that that choosing freedom or choosing forgiveness gave me freedom, is like reminding myself of that was what it was like encoded in me just as much as the trauma was. But you have to choose it. You have to choose to be aware of it. You have to like choose to remember that forgiving gives you freedom.
Yeah, I think this is really a key point, because a natural mechanism in people is to suppress pain and forget the hurt. And that, of course, only intensifies its power. Mm-hmm. It never goes away just because you're not thinking about it or because somehow you've forgotten it. I mean, really, in just in psychological terms, that's just a true mechanism that people employ. So the way out of that is the exact opposite, which is what you're describing, mm-hmm. which is not to forget, but to remember in the correct spirit and in the correct context. And you must have felt different or emerging as a different version of yourself as you were healing.
Oh my gosh. Like such a deeply different version.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and that was really the freedom in it. And that process so much for me happened within my own spiritual journey and kind of switched the lens for me when it came to forgiveness and healing. You know, from a spiritual standpoint, it was this deeply loving act to create the space for healing, you know, to not forget and push it down and pretend like it didn't happen, but to actually face it with compassion and look at it and keep choosing to look at my life and who I was, and through a lens of ownership, you know, to be like, okay, everything happens for a reason. If I truly believe that, what is the reason? What gift can I get from this?
Yeah. Well, you know, one of my favorite Aldous Huxley quotes is, experience is not what happens to you, it's what you do with what happens to you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, just the same way that sometimes some of the superficially worst things that happened to me in my life became with looking at them with a fresh eye, and then working hard after the fact. The worst things that happened to me turned into or led to a lot of the best things that have ever happened to me.
Mm.
So, you know, we have this power. It's on the other side of the viewpoint that says we're powerless, we're depressed, nothing is ever going to go right. But in fact, it's not just talk. We have the power to turn the worst of events towards the light. If we can marshal our forces and find the way to do it. So, you know, I commended you on your bravery before, when we weren't in public like this, but I'm not the only person that gets that impression, I'm sure.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah, I guess, and even just talking about it now, it really does land so powerfully that it's such a choice of freedom, forgiveness, and
yeah. See, this is the freedom that my mother's cousin could never have. And it was very clear that she was unfree in that sense, that she was limited. She was a spirit limited and unfree.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, it's all I can do is write about it and hope that people will see. Because the poem's really about the mystery of whatever it took. Because, whatever it, and I wanted to get around to asking you this, because there are two other sides to this topic that we haven't really touched on. One is what happens when we have hurt someone and we need to ask for forgiveness. Because I think when those things happen, we do dwell on whether we deserve forgiveness. We don't just say, I know I hurt you, but to forgive is divine, so give me a break. It doesn't work like that. You have to show that you've changed somehow, that you own what you've done, you know that you've caused pain, you're sorry for it, and that you intend to change what's necessary in your behavior to make sure that it doesn't continue. So that's one thing, is how do we ask for forgiveness? And the other side of that is what happens when we do ask and it's not given to us.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm asking the questions, your turn. This question's a great way to dodge things.
Awesome. Okay, so the first part of the question was about asking for forgiveness.
Yeah.
Well, as you were saying that and as you were asking it, the first thing that popped into my mind was that just the simple act of owning that there's some kind of hurt that you created, some kind of thing that you'd like forgiveness for, in and of itself is one, releasing for you.
Yeah,
and
the first step. Certainly.
Yeah. And almost that true act of ownership is also a compassionate way of forgiving yourself, or can be.
Yeah.
And I also think that it opens the door for possibility that may not have been there if you hadn't asked. You can't actually ask for forgiveness if you don't ask for forgiveness. You can't get forgiveness if you don't ask for forgiveness. So I think part of it is acknowledging
anything. Yes.
Right. Yeah. Like anything. And there's also something freeing, I think, also for yourself in just saying the thing. It's almost like you can give yourself the gift of forgiveness in actually asking for forgiveness. Or I guess, honestly, the thing that resonates with me even more is just owning the thing. Whether or not you get the forgiveness, to me, it's the power is actually in owning that there's something to forgive.
Yeah. In my life, I have to say, times that I've hurt others, and there's so many different shades of intent. Whether you do it on purpose or not, you can cause pain for someone. But if it's somebody that you are close to and you want to remain close to, you have to ask forgiveness for yourself. You also have to ask forgiveness in order to not kill off whatever relationship you have because of the breach of trust. And in order for you to, you have to ask and own what you've done. But I think you also, at least in my case, times that I've hurt people, it happened because I was being selfish and I was thinking about myself and not about them and their, whatever their needs were. I was thinking about my own. So when you realize that that's the source of what you've done, I think that you can ask to be forgiven, but if you want to stay close to the person, you've got to show that you're able to consistently put her or his needs ahead of your own. That you're essentially promising not to be bound up with yourself, which is really just leading yourself back to the foundation of what love is in a friendship or in any other kind of important relationship.
Yeah. I think the only part that could get tricky is that, like, in promising that you will put them first, we inevitably are humans and are going to choose ourselves at some point. But I think the act of us actually owning, hey, I realize that I was selfish in this moment and I'm sorry if I hurt you.
Yeah.
Is actually creating that bridge and that healing just in the act of saying that.
But you do need to follow up.
Yeah, I think you have to walk the talk.
It's a necessary, what in mathematics they used to call a necessary but not sufficient condition. You got to ask, and then you've got to walk, as you say, you've got to walk the walk.
Yeah.
And then, okay, so then that leads me to what happens when the person, when you've done something and they can't forgive you. Mm-hmm. I suppose you can throw your hands up and say that's their problem. But it does happen.
It does happen. It does happen. And there's so many different places to look with that. Looking within yourself at what part of you needs their forgiveness, looking at whether or not you've actually forgiven yourself. And then I think also looking at whether or not you can choose forgiveness for yourself, whether or not you've received it from someone else.
Now, okay, I'm going to put you on the spot. You've been on the earth a little less than half as long as I have. Is there something that you can conceive of that happening to you that you could not forgive?
I think 5 years ago, I would have said a whole list of stuff.
Really?
Yeah. Before I started going on this journey of, within myself and the awareness that I've been very lucky to kind of garner over the past couple of years of doing a lot of inner work, I probably would have said something like rape or someone killing a family member or, maybe someone who set off a huge atomic bomb. I think there are examples that my rational brain can think of. And I so deeply and truly, and I would have to probably remind myself of this a whole lot, but I really truly believe in the goodness of the human soul and that people are human. And I think this is one of the reasons why I was able to forgive the man who raped me, was that I know he's a human and he has goodness and he has darkness. And humans, I think a lot of the time, are a little bit selfish, and that shows in all sorts of ways. But I think having compassion for the human condition allows, at least for myself, allows me the possibility of forgiving even the hardest things.
I'm not sure who said it, but the operative sentence is to understand all is to forgive all. So that's what you just said about human nature having both a light and dark sides, and recognizing that that even the most brutally selfish acts were done out of something that is somewhere within each of us, even if we don't access it and don't allow ourselves to ever act on it. Mm-hmm. I think that the other line that I always liked is, there's no crime of which I do not consider myself capable. So what that says to me is simply, I understand how somehow I could get from where I am now to that place where that person did that thing. It's not utterly alien to me. I can't feel superior to it, but I can commit myself to not following those impulses and that side of my nature.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the other thing that just came up as you were saying that too is that like every act, no matter how atrocious, no matter how hurtful, at the very, very core of any of it is a wound.
Yeah.
It's some kind of a hurt that happened to them. And that also allows me so much compassion that like even the worst things come from a place of hurt.
Yeah, I think it's worth saying. I mean, what you're talking about now leads us to something that to me is deeper than the definition of forgiveness as we've been talking about it, because we've been talking about it as a way to heal our own wounds. But what you've just said, and I agree with you, suggests that it isn't just that we're capable of forgiving others, but we're capable of empathizing with them.
Yeah.
And that's a different thing. And to me, it's a deeper thing.
Mm-hmm.
Because you can decide to forgive somebody that just did a thoughtless thing without ever thinking about the motives behind it or who that person is and why she or he is at that point in their life or their day that they had to say or do that thing.
Mm-hmm.
You can just let it come to terms with it within yourself and move on with your life, and that's fine. But ultimately, if you really believe in the interconnectedness of the human experience, Jean Renoir said, the great French director, he was the son of the painter Auguste Renoir. He said, in a good play, everyone is right. In other words, even the villain thinks he's doing things for a good reason.
Mm-hmm.
So to understand that is to get, I think you have to cross that distance to come to grips with the nature of evil and having it exist. Because a lot of people blunt themselves against that rock. Why is there evil? Why do people behave this way? And you already put your finger on it. It's because they're people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And somewhere in there's a hurt. And, I think having that understanding that all of these acts come from a place of a wound is also the other thing that popped into my mind was Don Miguel Ruiz, the 4 agreements. And one of the agreements is never take anything personally. And it has been my favorite one. It's the one that just so powerfully changed everything for me because, it's not actually, their actions are not about me.
Yeah.
They're about a hurt or a wound or some perspective that they have.
Yes.
So that also opens up a lot of doors for this kind of forgiveness that we're talking about. Like it's not about me. They're not, cutting me off in traffic because it's about me. That's where they're at,
Yes. Well, I don't know about these 4, say them again, the 4 what?
The 4 agreements.
Okay.
It's a great book.
About that, but it's true. Friends of mine who are convinced that the world is against them are placing way too high a price on their own identities. The world doesn't is mostly indifferent to us.
And I realize that we only have about 2 minutes left, and I want to make sure that we kind of leave people with a little something, because when we were talking about doing this episode, I think one of the reasons why forgiveness is a really powerful topic before a new year is that it really does give you the opportunity to release whatever it is that's holding you, for you, more than anything for you, to really release whatever anger or resentment or fear, because it's been a really big year for a lot of people. 2018 held a lot for people, whether it was amazing for you or most likely there was some challenge in there. So I guess the call to you all out there is, what would it be like to choose forgiveness for yourself for a new year, to step into a new year unburdened by whatever it is that you're holding, whatever fear or anger or resentment, whatever thing happened to you this year, being able to choose to release as an act of self-love and compassion.
I think that's a much more organic way to look at the end of a calendar year and the beginning of a calendar year. It's much deeper than what we have, which is the kind of flimsy resolution.
Mm-hmm.
It's talking about a summing up and a kind of a rebirth through forgiveness. And it really ought to be part of the culture. That should be what we are thinking about on New Year's Eve.
I love it.
Don't think that's going to happen, but think about it.
Hopefully a few people will do it now. But a big thank you, Al. Thank you for coming and for sharing this space and your brilliance with us. It was wonderful to have you on here.
Well, it was great fun, but it was also you have a unique platform. So thank you for giving me a chance to act in it.
No, it's an honor. If you're looking for more information on Al, you can go to albasil.com. And if you're looking to get in touch with me and want a little bit of support going into a new year, you can find me at lovelivingholistics.com. So thank you so much for all of you out there, whoever is joining and listening. I am so very grateful, and I wish you so much love in your life. Happy New Year, everybody.
Yeah, let's start fresh.
Thank you for listening to Love Living Radio, Ignite Your Whole Being with Emily Perkins. Tune in every second and fourth Wednesday at 7 p.m. Eastern on transformationtalkradio.com as Emily shares the power of living your life with love and loving the life you live. For more information or to listen to past shows, visit lovelivingholistics.com. That's lovelivingholistics.com. See you next time.